Okay, so it is 3 a.m. in the morning, UK time. We are up to session 20 of 24. So at least we're on the right first number now. Joining us for our 20th session of 24 is Mr. Matt Raible. Hey Matt, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm tired, Matt. Yeah, but I'm feeling okay actually, not too bad. What do we have? We have front-end development for back-end developers. This is going to be a good session, Matt. I know I've been saying that for every session pretty much. It's actually such a good set of sessions. I'm looking forward to every one. So our session today is sponsored by Google Cloud. So thank you Google Cloud. We also had the vJUG down for participating in this session. I'm not sure we've been able to track them down right now, so maybe they're online. Reach out to us on Slack if you're there, and we'll add you to the Hangout. A couple of notes before we get started. The Google Cloud Platform has a huge number of cloud services, from infrastructure as a service, big data, machine learning, and there's also a Kubernetes environment to easily run containers at scale, as well as managed application platform called the App Engine, which I'm sure people are more potentially familiar with from the years gone by. The Google App Engine allows developers to build modern web and mobile applications on an open cloud platform, and now they support Java 8, and you can use your own framework like Spring Boot. So Google are also working closely with the Spring ecosystem to produce the Spring Cloud GCP, which provides a whole bunch of the Spring Boot starters, which you may be familiar with, to easily consume some of the Google Cloud Platform services like Cloud SQL, messaging with Pub Sub, that kind of stuff. So take a sneak peek of that. Let the Google guys know your feedback. Check out those links. There's a whole bunch of tutorials on that first link and some interesting stuff on the second as well. So do check that out. And a big thank you to Google for being our gold sponsors again for the second year running. vJUG is also sponsored by Zero Turnaround. So go to zeroturnaround.com and spend all of your money there with as many licenses as you can possibly buy. And I'll leave it at that. The next session, to interact with the session on Slack, you can go to the live session channel and ask questions, have discussion there. The link to join the Slack channel is in the vJUG24.com page. You just scroll down just underneath the video. There's the link there. You can also tweet vJUG24, and do make sure your video quality is at its highest. You can check that by clicking the cog at the bottom of the video and selecting the highest resolution. So without further ado, so whereabouts are you right now, Matt?
I'm in Montana, Billings, Montana.
So that's not your home, is it? Or is it?
No, I'm making a road trip up to see my parents where I grew up in the cabin without electricity.
I remember now. We were talking about this. So you're not actually there yet, are you? You're staying somewhere where there's good Wi-Fi right now, right?
Right. I'm at a Marriott, and well.
Awesome. So yeah, when you're ready, we have about 45 minutes, and then we'll take some questions as well, and in your own time.
Okay. So you can see my screen?
Yep.
And you can see my slides?
Yeah, that's good.
All right. So this presentation is front-end development for back-end developers. I just want to recognize the image on this opening slide is from Pixnio, pixnio.com/space. So a pretty cool image that I think resonates with Virtual Jug and shows that we're a worldwide community. So my name is Matt Raible. I'm a pick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity and no running water for 16 years. I had to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop every day. Seemed like it was uphill both ways, but not so much. I grew up in this cabin. This is a cabin I'm on my way to right now. My sister was born in one corner and I was born in the other. So it's a pretty unique childhood. And I have an expensive obsession with Volkswagen buses and Vanagons. And they're a lot of fun, but can be costly. I'm a developer advocate for a company called Okta. And I like to say we do user management in the cloud, or users as a software service. The abbreviation for that is UAS. So we like to say user management as a software service, like UMass. So a little bit better if you're interested, developer.okta.com. We basically do authentication in the cloud using a number of open source or authentication standards like OAuth for open authentication, OpenID Connect, and SAML. And basically today we're going to talk about JavaScript and TypeScript, build tools, JavaScript frameworks, CSS, progressive web apps, and JHipster. And part of the reason I came up with this talk is because I got my start in web development, and that's what I originally did back in the early 90s. I started writing web pages before Netscape 1.0 even came out in 93. And I continued until the late 90s when I started getting into Java. And the reason I got into Java was just because the guys that were working on Java in the project I was working on were just taking like a week to fix stuff. So I dove in and started writing Java. And even though I wrote bad Java, I wrote a lot of it and learned a lot about it, and got some certifications, stuff like that. 2001, I got into open source and struts. 2004, I wrote my first book on Spring. And 2004 and 2008, I basically spent all my time in backend land, what I would call the Java MVC frameworks, and working at LinkedIn and basically doing a lot of server-side stuff, doing a lot of consulting around Spring and training around Spring. And even though I enjoyed it, it wasn't where my true passion was, because I got my start in the front end. And so in 2009, I got kind of back into front end doing some GWT programming for evite.com. In 2010, I did more of like leadership and some prototyping at Time Warner Cable. Did a bunch of Java at Overstock. So this whole time I was doing on a front end and back end. 2011 to 2013, basically got into jQuery and Angular. And that really kind of sparked my interest in the front end. 2015, all Angular all the time. And basically 2016, I did Java at Stormpath and Angular at Computer Associates. So that was kind of fun, splitting my time between the two and doing an Angular in the afternoon. And now basically I love Java, Spring Boot, Angular, and TypeScript. Of course, I like skiing and driving VWs as well, but when I have to program, I like to use those ones. So what is modern front-end development? That's a question that a lot of people ask, and I tend to ask at conferences. And usually it's easy to ask an audience, but a little bit more difficult here. So is it JavaScript? Is it TypeScript? Is it CSS? I believe it's basically very difficult to keep up with. And so I've done my best to keep up with it over the years. But you can see, in 2004 is when it really got kind of very aggressive, I would say, because that's when things really started happening. That's when JSF 1.0 came out. That's when Spring 1.0 came out. Early 2005, Ajax term was coined, and that really development from the server-side perspective, in the sense that even though there was all these productive web frameworks like Tapestry and Struts and Grails 1.0, right, and Struts 2.0, there was really a lot happening in the JavaScript space. And so part of the reason this all happened was just because the browsers got better. So front-end development has changed a lot since 2005. I don't know if you're old enough to remember the good old days of 2004 and 2005, and it was just Struts and Spring MVC, but they worked pretty well and people really didn't have a problem. But then along came JSF. And that was supposed to be the savior, but what really happened is it came along at the same time that jQuery came along in Ajax. And that turned into the JavaScript framework explosion. And they laughed at us in Java land for having so many web frameworks. And all of a sudden, there was a new framework every week for JavaScript. So 2016 and 17 were definitely, 15 and 16 were definitely the heyday for all those JavaScript frameworks. But some leaders have started to emerge, and now there's progressive web apps and web frameworks. And you can write native apps with web frameworks with Ionic, Xamarin, NativeScript, and React Native. So it's pretty crazy what's happened, but it's started to really level out. And there's not as many as there used to be. Overwhelming if you're new to the space. There's a great article written on hackernoon.com about how it feels to learn JavaScript in 2016. But I think what you have to remember is if you're kind of new to the JavaScript space, you were probably new to whatever programming space you're into now. If that's Java, then you were new to Java at one point. And you probably weren't overwhelmed then. You were just interested in learning what you need to learn to get your job done. And so you were probably very curious as well. And I think what you need to realize when you're coming into JavaScript land is and mad about so many options, but just try to be excited and curious about what there is available. And so back when you were first learning Java or whatever it might be, for me, it was a great time to be a programmer because it was, learning all this new stuff, and, there was so much out there that I wanted to learn. So today I'm going to try to teach you the tools and techniques that you'll need for front-end development and making it, exciting to learn again. So trying to take all those options, just whittle it down to a few so you don't have to concentrate on everything that's out there. You can just concentrate on the things that I think are worth learning. And the biggest skill that you need to have is the willingness to learn and curiosity, because curiosity is key. You have to be, curious on how things work, and you probably were with whatever your favorite programming language is now. So I just encourage you to have that same open mind for JavaScript. So let's do some learning. Basically, it's important before we get into the different frameworks and how you do build tools and all that to talk about what is JavaScript. So there's basically ES ECMAScript, which is a number of different versions and flavors. ES3 was actually released in 1999, and that was IE6, which if you were a web developer at that time, you probably loved it because it was a great browser compared to what we have. ES4 is actually abandoned, so that never happened because of political differences. And then ES5 wasn't released until 2009. So that was, a big boost for a lot of the things that happened since then. And then ES6 introduced classes and modules. It was also known as ECMAScript 2015, and that was released in June of 2015. And then ES6 is technically ECMAScript 2017, and that's been released in June 2016. So the only features that have is an exponential operator and a prototype.include. So not a lot of features in that, but some pretty good stuff happening. But there's also TypeScript. So TypeScript really allows you to do a lot of the things that weren't available or were supposed to be available on ES7 or ES6. So this is a graph of what browsers support, or a caniuse.com search for ES5. And so you can see that almost all browsers have great support for ECMAScript 5, but that was released in 2009. And if we look at ES6 classes, just in particular, you'll see that IE11, they're not doing any new development on that, so they're not going to add that. That's not there. And then Opera Mini, which not that many people use, so pretty good support for ES6 classes. And then there's TypeScript. So TypeScript is basically giving types to JavaScript. And if you're a Java developer or a typed language developer like .NET or C#, then chances are this will be very familiar to you and you'll like it. You basically can install the compiler with npm install-g TypeScript, and then you can see on that function greeter there is a type of string on the person. And so you can use it, just like regular JavaScript in a document if you want. And then TSC, greeter.ts, actually compiles that file into an ES5 compatible file that can be read in a browser. So this is straight from the TypeScript tutorial there. But JavaScript already has a number of types that you're probably aware of, like number, string, and Boolean. And TypeScript adds additional ones like tuple, enum, any, and void. It also adds interfaces and generics. And what this really gives you is IntelliSense and refactoring and reference lookup in your IDE that can really be a real productivity boon. And the cool thing is you can actually run the TypeScript compiler on existing JavaScript, and it'll tell you where there's potentially errors. So TypeScript is more about classes and functions. For example, this is a class called bus, and you can see the Elvis operator in the constructor there makes that an optional parameter. And actually using Angular and any TypeScript, TypeScript in any sort of framework, you actually don't need the this.name in the constructor there. It'll do that automatically for you. And then standard getters and setters, the way that JavaScript does them. And you can see there's even string interpolation, which is more of an ES6 feature than really a TypeScript feature. So the types are a TypeScript feature, and then the automatic setting of local variables is a TypeScript feature. But otherwise, this is just ES6. And so TypeScript 2.3, actually, this is a video that hopefully plays, that all you have to do on a regular JavaScript file is just put in ts-check, and VS Code is actually smart enough to know that, hey, you haven't imported certain things, or the properties don't exist. So that's a very cool thing that you didn't even have to use anything more than your IDE to figure out those kind of issues. So then, before we get into build tools, before you can write any code in TypeScript or ES6, you need a tool to make your code work in older browsers that only supports ES5. So typically this is Node, pretty much all the time. And so Node really, stormed onto the stage and became a very cool thing in the late 2000s because it's basically Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine taken out of the browser and made as a command line tool. You might have heard it being used as a server-side framework using Express.js, but it's also very popular just to build front-end applications. So you install it from nodejs.org. You can also use MVM. There's a link to it at the bottom there. That'll allow you to switch between Node versions or NPM versions. So that can be very handy if you're working on several Node projects. And so once you have Node installed, then you get to choose your build tool. And the old school way of doing it up until about a year ago or a year and a half ago was Gulp. Before that, it was Grunt. And then a lot of people are using System.js nowadays, but the real hipster thing to do is to use Webpack. So a lot of the Angular tutorials and C projects and everything out there use System.js, but more and more I'm seeing Webpack out there. And then for downloading dependencies, of course, you can just use a CDN link for your CSS or JavaScript, but if you want to actually have it locally or concatenate it or build it as part of your project, then you'll use basically Yarn these days or npm5, which both of those have caching built in. So even though when you use them, you typically download the internet and all its friends, they cache something, so they are getting a lot better. And then the old school way of doing it is Bower, but typically I haven't seen a lot of new school projects doing it that way. But you'll notice here, I think one of the most important things, if you have a good build tool, is if it has a good logo. So all of these projects have done a good job of having a logo. So now you know if you're going to get into that space, make sure you have a logo. And then there's the Yeoman workflow. So the Yeoman workflow is basically a web scaffolding tool for building modern web apps. It has a command line tool called Yo that creates an app for you. So you type Yo JHipster, for instance, and it generates an app. And then it promotes easy installation of new JavaScript libraries with something like Bower npm, and live reload with Grunt, Gulp, or Webpack, and then testing with like Karma or Phantom.js. So kind of giving you that full experience of being an engineer on the front end and having your build tools do as much automation as possible for you. And then one of the best things that's happened in the web space, as far as I'm concerned as a web developer, is browser sync. So if you're not familiar with browser sync, this is a great video. I don't know if you'll be able to hear the sound on it, but I'm gonna play it anyway here. And you can see he's even using an iOS simulator here. So it's a great tool, and you can easily use it from Gulp. And it's awesome because it basically reloads your browser for you. You never have to hit F5 or refresh again. This is just an example as a Gulp task because it's super easy to show that. It just watches your files for changes and then kicks off browser sync reload. So I highly recommend that as a tool. And then the next thing to talk about is Webpack, because this is the hipster one. It's basically a module bundler for modern JavaScript applications. And when Webpack processes your application, it builds a dependency graph that includes every module your application might need and then spits it out. So you can see here in the diagram, we might have Sass, we might have JPEGs, we might have PNGs, and it processes those and versions them, concatenates them, does module bundling and splitting. It's incredibly configurable, and basically you only need to understand 4 concepts to get started: entry, output, loader, and plugins. And so you'll basically write your code, which is something like this bar.js function here, and then you'll create a Webpack config. Well, first you'll import that bar into another class, and then you'll have your Webpack config.js. That's just the standard name for Webpack config, and you have an entry point, which is that app, and then you'll output a file name, and then you'll basically just run Webpack, and it'll create that bundle.js for you. And it's that simple. So it's not you know, a whole lot of difficult configuration to set up. It's just that input and output, and then if you want to do plugins to transform, you know, from say TypeScript to JavaScript, then that's just a plugin that you configure. And here's a more advanced example that kind of shows, you know, the entry, the output, and then some loaders, for instance, the Raible loader to do React, you know, processing and make that from a ES6 into an ES5 class. And if you want to learn more about Webpack, I highly recommend checking out webpack.academy. That's an actual valid URL. And so there's a number of good tutorials on there that you can learn for free, as well as if you want to pay for some, you can do that for some more advanced ones. And I think this is a great project that's been set up by Sean Larkin, and I just want to recognize Sean as one of the main contributors to Webpack, and he's just done an awesome job of making open source very nice and helping people when they have a lot of problems with Webpack. So any projects that have problems with Webpack, you can actually put in a GitHub issue, like tag him, and he'll come and help out. So great community member there. But I think one of the best parts about Webpack is really that we're back into compiling in the front-end code, which means, you know, more slacking off and you know, waiting for your code to compile. So it's funny now that the projects that I do use Webpack on typically have TypeScript in them, and the Java actually compiles faster than the JavaScript these days. So that's kind of interesting. So in my opinion, the leading JavaScript frameworks, I said I would try to narrow your decisions down to just a few, are Angular, React, and Vue.js. And this is based on patterns that we've seen on our website and SDKs that we've created both at Stormpath and Okta that people are most interested in. And it's also based on just a gut feel that I have. And I had some pretty good gut feelings back in the day on typical or the Java web framework space. And so so sometimes when I have a gut feel, it actually works out okay. But don't just take my word for it. There's this guy, Eric Elliott, that wrote this great article last December on the top JavaScript frameworks and topics to learn in 2017. And he said, basically, Angular, React, Redux, and RxJS. So those are the hot ones. There's another article from HackerNoon that I found that said Angular, React, Vue, Ember, and Meteor. But you'll see Angular, React, and Vue are in both of those. So, or not Vue, but Angular and React certainly. And you'll notice in this slide, he says basically Angular and React dominate. Nothing else even comes close, except for jQuery, which kind of is everywhere. But the thing I really like about being a front-end developer is you can use Chrome DevTools, and you can go to a site like medium.com, and you can make a page actually fit nicely into a slide by just adjusting the margins and things like that, by clicking on the elements and adjusting the CSS. So that's the real power of being a front-end web developer. So one thing I like to show when I'm talking about, you know, why you might choose these few frameworks is just some pretty graphs. You can take these for what you might think, but more than anything, they're just pretty graphs with some statistics from people that are using them or hiring for them. So this is from jobs on Indeed.com. I do not think this is a worldwide search. I think it's just US only. But you can see that a lot of companies are hiring for Angular and for React. And I just gathered all these statistics yesterday. And I also replaced Aurelia recently in this most recent presentation today with Polymer. Just because I didn't see much usage of Aurelia or hiring for it, so I figured we'd look at Polymer and kind of add that in there. But you can see here, not a lot of companies hiring for that. And interestingly, since I did this last presentation, or this presentation last time in September, Backbone and Knockout are the only ones to decline. If you look at Stack Overflow tags, you'll basically see that there's a lot of people having a lot of problems with Angular and React. That's one way to look at it. But there's been 6,000 new tags just since last month with Angular alone. So there's definitely a lot of people asking questions about it. And I think this is a good representation of the community size. I think Stack Overflow tags, yes, it does mean that people are asking questions and having problems, but it also means there's a lot of people using it if there's a lot of tags. So Stack Overflow did a trends analysis back in May of this year, and you can see that they found jQuery used to be among the most popular tags on Stack Overflow, but it's actually in decline. And then AngularJS also had huge growth, but also in decline. And then they've seen the fastest growth of React and Angular as well. And then if you look at GitHub stars, I think this is very interesting because this is people that are usually developers. There's not many people outside of the developer community that are actually creating GitHub accounts. And so React and Vue are very popular there and growing the fastest. Angular in the last month got 1,000 new stars, React got 3,000, and Vue.js got 4,000. So you can see the GitHub star growth kind of really shows that Vue is really taking off and a lot of people are using it. I think the reason for that is it's very familiar if you're coming from jQuery or AngularJS. It's very easy to learn and it's very lightweight, which makes it popular for mobile applications. So let's look at how to create a hello world with each of these frameworks, just to give you a brief overview. So this is hello world with Angular. You can see you import a component from Angular core, and then there's something that looks like an annotation in Java. It has a selector which maps to the HTML at the bottom there, and then it has a template with backticks that allows you to pass in variables using those double curly braces. So that looks pretty simple. That's less than 10 lines of code there. But the problem is with Angular, you actually need a fair bit more. You need a module to actually declare that component, and then you can import browser module. You don't need forms or HTTP module for this particular example, but you will if you develop a real app. And then you bootstrap that app component. But then you're not quite done. You also need a main.ts to bootstrap everything else. So this, if you're doing server-side rendering, this might look a little different. This is for rendering, in the browser. So it took, 3 files just to get to hello world. And so that's why they created Angular CLI. So CLI.angular.io. It's basically easy to install. You run ng new to create a new app. You CD into it, and you run ng serve. And they basically hide Webpack as a configuration from you. And you don't really have to worry about it. You just run the ng commands, and you can do a whole bunch with it. So this is just a screenshot of me creating a new my cool app component, and it's associated HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. And then there's an app module. There's environments for production and development, and then the good old index.html, and a number of testing classes. And so it goes through all that. You can see it took 37 seconds just to do that, mostly because it did an npm install, and that could take up to 30 seconds to 5 minutes depending on the internet connection. And then I run ng serve, and it's available on 4200. So pretty easy to get started there. It takes less than a minute if you have a fast connection. And so if you're using Angular CLI and you're already familiar with it, you might want to take a look at this blog post. It really basically tells you some tips and tricks about Angular CLI that even I didn't know, and I've been using it for over a year. For instance, there's a -- minimal flag where you only create the minimum files you need, 14 files. There's no templates. Everything's just inlined in the TypeScript classes, and there's no tests. So this can be a faster way if you're just doing a quick demo and not writing any tests. So some real gems in there. And then the other ways to get started with Angular are the Angular Quick Start, which is part of the official documentation. And this uses System.js last time I looked. There's Seed and Angular Seed Advanced. So Angular Seed has internationalization, has full Docker support, has support for Angular Mobile Toolkit. And then the advanced one has some more things like AngularLytics, native script support, and Electron cross-platform desktop app support. So what you do with those ones is you just git clone them off GitHub, and then you delete the .git directory, and it's your project at that point. You can change whatever you like and start it and go from there. So I created this ng demo project on GitHub that shows you how to get started with Angular CLI and create a simple search application. And it also shows you how to do testing. And so that first YouTube video is how to build an app. The second one is how to test it. And it also has in that ng demo README file. It's basically a big long tutorial. I printed it out at one point, and it was like 60 pages. So it shows you, how to do that stuff, and then it shows you how to integrate Bootstrap, shows you how to integrate Material Design or Angular Material, and also how to log into my company's stuff, Okta. So I wrote this tutorial back in April about Angular authentication with OpenID Connect and Okta in 20 minutes. It uses a library from Manfred Steyer, called Angular OAuth 2-OIDC. So if you need to do OAuth 2 or OpenID Connect with Angular, doesn't matter if you use Okta, you could use Keycloak, you could use Google, you could use Facebook, anyone who supports OAuth, it should work with that. So it's a nice way to integrate authentication into your application. And more than anything, I usually show this video because I love the guy's soothing voice. OpenID Connect has this 5-minute video on YouTube from their chairman, and he's just got a soothing voice. It feels like you just went to a yoga class after you've listened to it. So I highly encourage you to check that out. I won't play it here because we're limited on time. So basically, OpenID is a thin layer on top of OAuth 2 that allows you to get user information. We have an API at Okta, developer.okta.com, and it's pretty darn cheap, as in free. So 7,000 monthly active users, up to 10 apps for free. Check it out. There's also Ionic framework. So Ionic, if you know Angular, you know Ionic. And so this is something that I think is really important because you're able to develop mobile applications that get deployed onto a phone using Cordova, used to be called PhoneGap, and it just works really nicely. And I bought the Ionic 3 book, and I expected it to take, a day to read. And what I found was most of it talked about how to do TypeScript and how to do Angular. So if you know TypeScript and Angular, then you can pretty much read that book in under an hour and know how to build, beautiful, amazing mobile web apps. There's also NG Book 2, which I think is awesome because the title is NG Book 2 and it's a complete book on Angular 4. If you're unfamiliar with the Angular versioning fiasco, they skipped Angular 3 because the router was already at version 3 or 4, and so they wanted to align all the versions. So that's why they skipped 3. There's Angular 4. I think Angular 5 is coming out maybe this month or next. I think it's a great book. It's worth your hard-earned money because it really focuses on testing a lot. And a lot of the Angular books that I looked at, besides this one, didn't really have a lot of testing information in there. So now let's move on to React. We've learned about Angular. Let's look at React. React is very familiar to just regular web developers because it's HTML and it's JavaScript. The difference is they embed JSX, they call it, which is basically HTML right in the JavaScript. So that's kind of weird for some people to get used to, but it does work quite nice once you're used to it. So my favorite React video is the one from Eric Vicente called Intro to React Workshop, and I highly encourage you to check this out. He basically takes you through developing this weather application, and the thing he does well is he has a GitHub repo and just copies and pastes code into the app as he goes. And the cool thing is you can just follow along by going to his repo and kind of doing it at the same time. So I enjoyed it very much. It took about an hour, and I learned a ton about React. And one of the things that he talks about is imperative code. So with imperative code, this is the way we've done JavaScript development with jQuery for many years. You're basically adding elements, you're modifying elements, you're moving elements, you're removing them. It's very verbose, and you're managing transitions and states. And it really gets hard with a lot of states. You can see here, this is an example of Facebook. If you have a lot of notifications over 99, your little notification badge doesn't have numbers on it, actually gets on fire. So I didn't even know this because I've never had, more than 99 notifications or whatever, but apparently it happens. So imperative code to do that, you can see is kind of messy here. Whereas declarative code defines the UI you want. So this returns HTML directly, and basically React diffs the HTML from components, similar to Git, and only adds what it needs. So you can see here that the difference between the first if and the second else is only the span class name badge. And so React is smart enough to actually not, re-render the div class name bell, but just to know the diff and actually add that part in the inner part. So that's why it gets to be so fast. And you can also see it is much less here. So React enables both styles of programming, but this is what it's really known for, is this kind of declarative code and having your DOM right in your code. And so Create React App is a way of getting started with React. You just npm install it, you run Create React App, and then the name of your app, you cd into it, and you run npm start. So you can see here, here's an example of doing that. They use Yarn by default. Yarn stands for Yet Another Resource Negotiator. Similar to Hadoop has a Yarn that actually stands for exactly the same thing. So Facebook developed their own implementation of npm to do installation and add a lot of caching and do a lot of things that they needed at Facebook at scale. And so that's why Yarn exists. And it has a Yarn start, Yarn run build, and basically prints out the instructions that you'll need to do it, to develop your app. But the thing I really like about it is actually ships with documentation. So you can see here, I took that my cool app that I created and checked it into GitHub, and it has a whole table of contents right in the README. And so we know that developers don't often read documentation, but we do like READMEs. And so I think this is a brilliant way of basically saying, hey, here's how to do stuff, and it's right in your project from the get-go. And if you want to do authentication with React, my colleague Lee Brandt wrote a tutorial on that using our sign-in widget. And now let's switch to Vue. So like I said, Vue's been really taking the world by storm. A lot of people are using it. A lot of people are liking it. You can see that we just have a message that's read from the data there, and you instantiate a new view. You have an EL that maps to an ID, and then you have data, or you have methods that are encapsulated in your Vue object, and you can easily get to those from your HTML. So this tutorial I found from Coding Explained is pretty good. It doesn't have a companion GitHub project though. If you do have an egghead.io subscription, I recommend build Vue.js apps with Vue CLI and Nuxt.js. So Nuxt.js is an implementation of Vue that runs on the server side first. So it does server-side rendering, and that makes the initial page load much faster. And then, of course, it's just like a regular app or a regular Vue app after that. So you can also use TypeScript with Vue, but this is an example of just doing regular JavaScript and importing the source and having a button. They use basically v dash for all their attribute and event handlers. And so you can see, you just click on the button there, and it calls in those methods. It'll call that function, and then there's a built-in event. If you don't pass it in, you can still get to it, and then typical alert. So Vue CLI makes it easy, just like Angular CLI and Create React App. You can install it, and then you can init it, and it has a number of template names, so that's what makes it a little different from the other ones that you can build from Webpack or System.js, or even have like a PWA. So pretty cool stuff there. You can see Vue init Webpack, my cool app that I ran here, and it does prompt you for a number of different values and variables. So that's something that the others don't really offer. And then the thing that I think is cool is they actually don't run npm install, so it happens very fast. So kind of a smart move on their part. They're not associated with running that npm install like the other ones are, which can take a little while. So nice little way to get started with Vue there. And then I wrote a tutorial on it just last month called The Lazy Developer's Guide to Authentication with Vue.js. And the reason I did that is basically I just took an existing example and hooked that into Okta using our auth SDK. So I made it easy because you didn't have to do a whole lot. The other thing I think is important if you're coming from the server side is to know that there is server-side support for many of these universals being merged into Angular 4. It's already in there, and people are using it. Mobile.twitter.com is running React and Node, but it talks to APIs on its backend. And then Nuxt.js I mentioned for Vue. And the basically idea behind these is instead of sending all the HTML and JavaScript to your browser and waiting for it to render a page, the initial page render happens on the server, and that can make things great for SEO and for that first experience for the users. And so since this is vJUG and we're talking to Java developers, I did want to make you aware that if you're doing React.js and Spring Boot, there's this blog post that shows you how to do that. And then there's also a Spring Boot Angular render that I believe has probably been renamed, but I think if you use that GitHub URL, it'll redirect to the new name, and that basically allows you to do the Angular universal stuff with Spring Boot. So pretty slick there. So now let's switch to talking about CSS. We're getting short on time. I think I got like maybe 5 minutes left. So cascading style sheets, if you know CSS.
No, sorry, you have like 15 minutes left. So
15 minutes? Okay. Yeah. So with cascading style sheets, not many people like them. There's a few people that really do like them, and chances are because they have a lot of experience with them, and they know what browsers do what and how to make things work when you run into issues. So it's gotten a lot better in the last year, but that means you have to get everyone on the latest browsers to get that experience. But this is just some basic CSS stuff. You can see that hash app there. That hash basically points to an ID in the HTML document, and you should only have one unique ID per page. And then blog post is for a class attribute. So you say class equals blog post, and that'll give that element padding around it. And then if you wanted to just refer to the first paragraph after that, you can use the greater than sign, and then p first actually only does the first paragraph versus the first nested paragraph. And then image plus span caption is how you do sibling relationships. And so a lot of times you won't actually need to get into this because there's a lot of CSS frameworks that'll do the hard stuff for you nowadays. But there's also Sass. And so as a programmer, as you're getting into web development, you'll probably like Sass a lot because Sass allows you to do things like variables and nest things, and basically gives you a better syntax for writing CSS. So definitely learn CSS first, but then don't be afraid of Sass. There's also Less, which used to be popular, but it's kind of declined in popularity, and Sass has kind of won the battle there. So I mentioned CSS frameworks, and these are something that I think has really given a huge boost to web developer productivity in the last 5 years. Largely started by Bootstrap. That's the big B on the right there. They basically give you the ability to have a bunch of widgets and components and things in your app with only modifying the HTML and maybe adding some classes to it. So it's kind of what we always wanted in web developer land, which is web components that you can just easily reference and they look good. And so these are the most popular ones that I think exist. There's Skeleton, which is a dead simple responsive boilerplate, clever name there. Pure is from Yahoo. Foundation, Zerb, is an important one there with the Yeti at the bottom there. And then Material Design is from Google. And this is an interesting one because it's not really a framework like the other ones that pertain to a number of different web applications. They actually have web components, Android components, and iOS components. So if we look at like the pure popularity of the particular material library, it doesn't really stack up to the rest, but there is like Angular material, there's React material, so there's many implementations of Google's material library. So Bootstrap is the most popular HTML, CSS, and JavaScript framework in the world for building responsive mobile-first projects on the web. At least that's from their website description. Now, I don't think of it as really a JS framework. It's mostly just a way for you to make buttons look good. So before Bootstrap, all our buttons look the same. Now we got colors on them, so it's starting to look a lot better. You can see that all you're really doing is adding classes, and it gives you nice behavior. And the thing that I really like is you can actually just have A tags, right, anchor tags, and add the classes, and it makes a link look like a button too. So kind of a slick feature there. And its grid makes it easy to lay out components in columns. So it's got a 12-column grid by default, and you can make things basically lay out like you want them to and not deal with CSS so much. And all of these have a very respectable number of stars. It's just that Bootstrap has a whole bunch more than everyone else. You can see that they're just kind of off the charts in general. And everyone, you know, has their respective projects on GitHub. The one I'm pointing to for Material Design is that Material Components, and then the Material Components Web, because they have, you know, components for iOS and Android as well. And so looking at the star history, you can see that Bootstrap's just been off the charts. And I'm not sure if they're the #1 project still on GitHub as far as stars are concerned, but they certainly were for a good year or two there. The other ones are growing, but certainly not as much as Bootstrap still is. So one of the things that happened to me in my career over probably the last 7 or 8 years is I did a lot of consulting with companies about performance. And as a Java developer and having expertise in UI, I was often brought in, and they expected that their problems were with actual Java code rather than front-end code. And what I found a lot of times is people just weren't aware of the front-end optimization techniques that you can use. So reduce your HTTP requests, gzip your HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. All browsers can handle gzipped content. Set far futures expires headers, so make sure like your static assets like CSS and images have, you know, unique MD5 sum tacked onto them so they can live for years. If you override that file and create a new one, then your build system should create a new image, file name as well. Do code minification and optimize your images. And the optimized images is probably the most important thing because people typically aren't optimizing their images, and it's one of the slowest things on the web. But there's also something interesting that's happening, and that's HTTP2. So HTTP2 is binary instead of textual, and it basically allows you to have one connection and send things back and forth. And the reason this is important is it makes the concatenation JavaScript and CSS files from, say, 10 files into one not as important anymore. And the browsers can actually handle many small files better than it can handle one giant file that has everything in it. So as far as the best practice of concatenating and minimizing JavaScript files, that might not be as important when you're moving to HTTP2. So keep that in mind. If you're doing a lot of headers, its header compression will certainly help you. And you can also allow servers to push responsive into client caches. So server push is a really cool part of HTTP2 as well. In my personal experience, the biggest problem that I've seen with HTTP2 is getting the cloud providers to support it because they have, proxies or API servers or whatever and load balancers in front of the instances. So you can easily start up a Spring Boot with Undertow that uses HTTP2, but getting the load balancer to understand that hasn't quite happened yet. So hopefully we'll see more implementations of HTTP2 this year from Heroku and Cloud Foundry and Clever Cloud and companies like that, and then we'll be able to leverage it more in our applications. So another thing to be aware of, obviously, is tools. So there's a great course called moderndevtools.com from Umar Hamza that really explains how to use Chrome's developer tools to find performance problems in your applications. He also has other tips on, for instance, using image source set on the image tag that you can basically load different size images for different display ports. And so on a mobile device, you can have a smaller image. On a bigger device, a nice big 30-inch monitor, you load a bigger image and works really nicely. So I highly encourage you to follow Umar just because he has tips all the time on just Chrome in general, and then Adi Osmani as well has a great blog or a great following, and he works for Google on developer tools as well. So that's a great way to make your development experience better, is learning a lot about Chrome developer tools. There's also tools for the frameworks themselves. There's Angular Augury or Augury. I haven't used it myself, but it does exist. The fact that it still says Angular 2 on their site might be an indicator that it's not getting updated that much. React Developer Tools works on Firefox and Chrome, and then Vue DevTools actually has a workaround that'll even work on Safari. So all three browsers supported by Vue DevTools there. And the thing I like about React and Vue, both of them, as soon as you open up Chrome DevTools when you're authoring one of the applications, it prompts you and says, hey, you might have a better experience if you use our DevTools. And sure enough, it's got a lot of nice information that prints to the console once you've installed those. The real big thing that I think is happening in this year, and basically started last year, it's getting a lot more interest this year, is progressive web apps. Progressive web apps is basically a way of having an app that stays installed in your browser. If you're using a mobile phone or even a desktop browser and you have the flags turned on, your browser will prompt you to install the application. And so then you'll get a shortcut on your desktop or in your applications folder that you can go to and click on and come back to. And not only is it installable, but it also works offline thanks to service workers. So service workers is a spec that actually allows you on a background thread to inspect the network and cache resources, check if you're offline, and basically allow your application to work offline. And then you need a web app manifest to give information to install your app, and you need it to be on HTTPS. And the real reason for HTTPS is to speed things up and to allow the tools that confirm that you've got a progressive web app to validate that it does work. And so a lot of this has come out of Alex Russell and his research on progressive web apps and a lot of work at Google. And this is from a talk that he did last year at Chrome Developer Summit, where he says, we basically failed on mobile. And the reason is because 3 seconds on a 3G connection is realistic. report found that 53% of visits are abandoned if a mobile site takes more than 3 seconds to load. And that same report said the average mobile sites load in 19 seconds. So that's pretty bad, right? 3 seconds, but it's really 19. And so we failed on mobile because a lot of times your laptop is a filthy liar. And we really need, you know, slower devices to inspect with. We need an unlocked Android device on a 3G connection to really know what the vast majority of the world experiences. Now, if you're developing an app that enterprise users use and they're always on a fast network, that might be different. But if you're developing something like Facebook or Google for the world, then you certainly might experience some issues with, you know, Asia or Africa not having some great internet connection and great phones. So the best way to fight back is implement the purple pattern, get that cheap Android device, use Chrome developers tools with inspect and DevTools networking and CPU throttling, and Lighthouse is another tool that's built into Chrome now that'll allow you to basically see how your performance is of your web app as well as how it does as a progressive web app and how it rates there. So the purple pattern is push, render, pre-cache, and lazy load. And so basically hold that initial route in the cache of the app. So it's only the first time it loads that the user has to load it, and then pre-cache the remaining routes and do lazy loading on everything else. So, you know, you don't really need to download that 2 megabyte bundle in the beginning. You just need to download the JavaScript that's needed to render that initial page, and then the other pieces can load as people click on links. And so I wrote a tutorial on building your first progressive web app with Angular and Spring Boot back in May. There's nothing in here about Okta or authentication, so it's a great way to just learn how to do progressive web apps. Components. So web components are reusable UI widgets created using open web technology. And I don't know if you heard, but MDN is now the new source of all things documentation on the web. Microsoft, Google, everyone's going to be contributing to that. And web components consist of 4 technologies: custom elements, HTML templates, shadow DOM, and HTML imports. And so Polymer is a framework that's based on web component technologies and use web components without Polymer. It's just kind of a bridge to try to get people that have older browsers still be able to use web components. There's also Stencil.js from the Ionic folks. And webcomponents.org is a library of a plethora of web components that you can use right now. So I encourage you to start looking into web components, because I think what we're going to see more and more is people that write these libraries with components using web components and then allowing them to be used across frameworks. So instead of just an Angular component, it would work in React and Vue and Polymer.
Hey, Matt, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So directory structures, they all kind of do it a little differently. This is, you know, Angular versus React versus Vue. Some of them have more testing infrastructure than others. You should also be aware of the OWASP top 10. Injection, just like it is an issue on the back end, NoSQL injection can be an issue on the front end if you're accepting user content and displaying it on the web page. Make sure and do that right. Make sure and know these. I did see the other day that there's a Maven plugin that does this now, so that's kind of cool. And JHipster. So JHipster is a Yeoman generator, creates a Spring Boot and Angular project on the front end, packages them all up in the same WAR jar and allows you to deploy them. So I wrote a tutorial on that that shows you how to create a blog post. And you can also build a microservices architecture with JHipster using Spring Cloud and Eureka Server and doing Zool proxying and all kinds of cool stuff there. As far as building a monolith, doing that blog demo, there is a link there to that JHipster 4 demo repo and microservices blog post I wrote, how to do those with JHipster. And I wrote a book because I like it so much. Written with ASCII Doctor. Tells you how to develop a real-world app. Just released the latest version last week. So we released 4.0 in September, and I updated it to fix some bugs. So I encourage you to download it free from InfoQ or follow it on Twitter. And I deployed the latest version on 21points.com of the example app last night. Got all that working, so I encourage you to check that out. So we learned about ES6 and TypeScript, Node.js and MVM, Angular, React, and Vue, CSS and SAS, front-end performance optimization, and progressive web apps. So the biggest thing I'd encourage you to do is just try and be curious and get into UI development, because you're probably being pushed there a little bit anyway. And you can see the results immediately, and it makes you look good in demos because you're the guy that wrote what they're looking at. So don't be afraid to try new things, learn JavaScript or TypeScript. Try one of these frameworks and form your own opinions. Or just wait a few months because there might be another one. You never know. But it is a great time in your life to be a programmer. So be curious. And don't forget to check out the Developer Okta blog. Tons of tutorials on Spring Boot, Angular, React, Ionic, Vue.js, and microservices. And if you want to keep in touch, hit me up on my website, raibledesigns.com. Follow me on Twitter. I uploaded this presentation and many others to Speaker Deck there. And a lot of the examples that I write live on Okta Developer. That's it.
All right, man.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for this awesome session. I know that you told me that you had this session work for like 90 minutes and you were able to do it in like 45. That's too much to cover. So thank you so much for doing that for us. So I'm looking into our Slack channel. I have a couple of questions here. Actually, I have 2 questions, and I'm going to make them into one because I think they are kind of related. So from Jorge and Alex Morelos. So Jorge asks if server-side rendering is dead. And then Alex Morelos asking if all the JSF you learned so far is useless now.
No, so I think server-side rendering is actually still seeing a lot of interest because we're seeing that it's still very fast. And so like mobile.twitter.com, even though that's a React app, the initial route is rendered from Node. So it's done on the server side. So I think you'll see more and more of that. It's something that I want to pursue with JHipster and making that first initial page really pop. Because using webpagetest.org to actually validate the 21 points app that I wrote and make that as good as it can be, it really needs to have some server-side rendering instead of having the JavaScript do everything once it's loaded. As far as JSF is concerned, I think that information on knowing how to do HTML and all that is still valuable, but I think it's worth learning one of these JavaScript frameworks and trying to leverage those as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. And from Shamir Parker, we also had the question asking about how hard it is to migrate from Angular 1 to Angular 4.
So migrating, I don't know if I'd recommend it. I have a JHipster app, the JHipster book blog that I wrote with AngularJS, and sure I could write it with Angular 4, but there's no real migration path. There is like an upgrade thing where you can have your new code running kind of side by side. So that's one way to do it. But for the 21 points app, I didn't try to upgrade. I just basically rewrote everything. So if it's a large app and it's working well and it's performing well, I don't know if it's actually worth the ROI to rewrite that next one with the latest version of Angular rather than rewriting your old ones.
Okay. And vJUG, are you guys with there? I know that you just sent a question on the Slack channel, but if you guys want to ask it directly over there.
No, by now. There is no questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. Oh, well.
Yeah. From Carlo Borja. Yeah, I can relay the question right here. So.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Regarding IDs, I use Liner, but I think all these found about this. Or do you comment another ID for web development, front-end development?
So we cannot really hear you, but I know I have the question right here. So basically, regarding IDEs for front-end, do you consider Visual Studio Code is the best? Sorry, Atom, Brackets, Sublime, whatever.
I think there's people out there that do, but I do not. I'm a big IntelliJ idea lover, and the reason I've stuck with IntelliJ over the last 10 years is basically because of its excellent web development support for both TypeScript, JavaScript, CSS. I got into it in 2005 and 6 because of its excellent Maven support, and that's why I've stayed with it. While I've done more front end, it's got excellent support there as well. So I don't think the other IDEs like NetBeans or Eclipse are quite there, but I know there's been a lot of work on NetBeans to make web development better. This code works as well.
Okay, and we run out of time. So thank you so much, Matt, for joining us for this awesome session. Thank you so much, Peru, for joining us as well. And we're going to go straight to the next session. So thank you guys for joining us, and stay tuned for having us Josh Long next with his session about reactive Spring.